When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the war ended in an instant. But the reality for the people living inside the country did not. Cities were burned out. Food was scarce. Families were separated. Millions of soldiers and civilians were returning from across Asia. And on top of all of that, Japan was about to be occupied by a foreign military for the first time in its entire history. From 1945 to 1952, the American occupation reshaped every part of Japanese life. Schools, jobs, politics, the role of women, the media, the economy, even what people ate and how they thought about themselves. This was a period of uncertainty, fear, curiosity, frustration, and eventually transformation. For the ordinary Japanese civilian, it was a time of survival first and rebuilding second. Life moved quickly, and nothing stayed the same for long. Today, we are going to look closely at what life was actually like for Japanese civilians during the American occupation. What people felt, what they feared, what changed. What changed, what stayed the same, and how the choices made in those 7 years shaped modern Japan. Let's start right at the moment the war ended, because civilian life changed. The second Emperor Hirohito's voice came over the radio. The shock of surrender on the 15th of August 1945. Most Japanese civilians heard their emperor speak for the first time in their lives. The recording was scratchy and formal, and many people struggled to understand what he was saying. But the message became clear. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. For some, the emotion was relief. For others, it was disbelief or humiliation. And for many, it was fear. This fear was not abstract. For years, wartime propaganda had warned civilians that American soldiers would kill them, torture them, or enslave them. So when it became known that American troops would soon arrive on Japanese soil, people did not know what to expect. Many families hid or destroyed anything that looked patriotic or militaristic. Children were told to stay indoors. Some families feared that occupation soldiers would storm into their homes. Others expected their belongings to be taken. Even after the surrender, civilians did not know whether the soon-to-arrive Americans would treat them as fellow human beings or as enemies. Then the ships arrived. The arrival of American forces when American troops landed at ports and airfields, a quiet tension filled the streets. Japanese civilians watched from behind windows or from a distance. What surprised many was the difference between wartime propaganda and reality. Instead of brutality, civilians saw soldiers who smiled, waved at children, shared chocolate, and gave canned food to people who needed it. This first interaction mattered. It broke the fear that had been built up for years. Civilians began to think that perhaps life under the occupation would not be as terrifying as they had imagined. But fear lifting did not mean that life was easy. The country's infrastructure was shattered. Food had not magically reappeared. The economy was still close to collapse. For Japanese civilians, daily life in 1945 and 1946 was defined by scarcity. Daily life in ruins Japan had already been struggling before the surrender. Years of total war drained resources, and the firebombing of Tokyo and dozens of other cities left millions homeless. Even before the American soldiers arrived, many families were living in makeshift shelters built from scraps of wood or corrugated metal. Food shortages were severe. Rationing had been strict during the war, but after surrender the situation got worse. Rice was scarce, which meant people relied heavily on sweet potatoes, barley, or whatever they could find. Black markets sprang up almost overnight. Civilians traded clothing, tools, family heirlooms, or anything valuable for food. For many adults, hunger was a constant companion. For children, malnutrition became a serious issue. You might imagine that the American occupation would solve these shortages quickly, but it took time. In the first year, even the American military struggled to understand just how desperate things were. Eventually, the occupation government, led by General Douglas MacArthur, began large-scale food imports. American wheat became a staple. School lunches were introduced to prevent widespread starvation among children, but even with that help, people had to stretch every calorie they had. And while civilians were dealing with shortages at home, the occupation authorities were dismantling the structures that had shaped their lives for decades. The Purge and the end of the old order. One of the first major policies of the American occupation was the removal of wartime leaders from positions of power. This was called the Purge. Thousands of government officials, military officers, police leaders, business heads, teachers, and media workers were removed from their jobs. Many had been involved in wartime propaganda or militaristic education. For civilians, this created a strange and sometimes chaotic moment. Teachers vanished from schools. Police stations changed leadership. Newspapers changed their tone almost overnight. People who had once been powerful suddenly disappeared from public life. Some civilians supported the change. Others worried about instability or the loss of experienced leadership. The occupation insisted on democratic reforms. This included freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the right to form political parties, and a new constitution. These ideas were introduced quickly, and civilians had to adapt. Some felt excited, others felt overwhelmed. Many simply tried to keep up with the changes while still struggling to find food. But one reform affected nearly every family more deeply than the political changes. This was the new role of women. New opportunities for women before 1945. Japanese women had very limited political or economic power. They could not vote and had few legal rights within marriage. The American occupation changed that almost immediately. Women gained the right to vote, to run for office, and to own property. Labor reforms protected women in the workplace. This was a dramatic shift. In the 1946 election, more than 13 million women voted. Dozens of women were elected to the national diet. For many civilians, this felt like a new world. Of course, social attitudes did not change overnight. Many men resisted the idea of women working outside the home, and many women were uncertain about how much they were allowed or expected to participate in public life. But opportunities that did not exist before suddenly became available. Women entered journalism, education, business, and politics. Over the next decades, these changes had long-term effects on Japanese society, while political and social reforms were taking place. The daily interaction between civilians and American soldiers became one of the most visible parts of occupation life. Life around the American soldiers, American troops, were stationed across the country. Some units lived among civilians, others in bases near towns and villages. Children, naturally curious, often approached soldiers to ask for candy or chewing gum. Soldiers were instructed to behave respectfully. For many civilians, this helped break down fear and resentment. But life around foreign troops was complicated. Some neighborhoods developed a lively culture around the bases. Small businesses, bars, restaurants, and entertainment spots catered to American soldiers. Some civilians saw this as an economic opportunity. Others disliked the influence of American culture and worried about declining morals. Relationships between American soldiers and Japanese women also became common. Some were loving and long-lasting. Many were short-term. A number of children were born from these relationships. Their lives were often difficult due to social prejudice and legal complications. This side of occupation life was sensitive and sometimes painful. It reflected the larger tension between defeat, dignity, survival, and the need to adapt to a new reality. Economic collapse and slow recovery. By the end of the war, Japan's economy had essentially collapsed. Factories were destroyed. Energy supplies were unreliable. Inflation was out of control. Civilians often carried stacks of cash to buy only a few items. Workers were paid in rice or goods, because money held so little value. To stabilize the economy, occupation authorities introduced new financial policies, land reforms, and industrial regulations. Land reform was especially important. Large landowners were forced to sell their land at low prices, and it was then sold to tenant farmers at affordable rates. Millions of rural families suddenly owned the land they worked. For many civilians, this was one of the most positive changes of the entire occupation. Industrial policy, on the other hand, was more complicated. Early in the occupation, the goal was to limit Japan's ability to wage future war. Some large companies were broken up. Later, after the Cold War intensified, policy shifted. Japan was encouraged to rebuild quickly to support the Western Bloc. This shift helped restore factories and stabilize jobs. For ordinary civilians, what mattered most was that work slowly returned, wages increased, and inflation came under control. By the early 1950s, Japan's economy was on the path to rapid growth. But economic changes were only part of the story. The occupation also reshaped the way civilians consumed media and information. New media and new ideas. During the war, newspapers, radio, and film had been tightly controlled. Propaganda dominated every form of communication. After the surrender, censorship did not immediately disappear. At first, the American occupation censored anything that supported militarism, nationalism, or anti-American sentiment. But compared to wartime controls, the atmosphere was far more open. Civilians were suddenly exposed to new ideas. Newspapers could criticize the government. Foreign books, films, and magazines entered the country. American music and fashion became popular with younger people. Jazz clubs opened. Hollywood movies were screened in cities. English phrases entered everyday speech. This cultural shift created a generational divide. Older civilians, shaped by pre-war traditions, found the new culture unusual or excessive. Younger people embraced it with enthusiasm. American culture did not replace Japanese culture, but it mixed with it, creating something new. Displaced civilians and returning soldiers. At the end of the war, more than 6 million Japanese civilians and soldiers were scattered across Asia and the Pacific. They were in Korea, China, Manchuria, Taiwan, the Philippines, and island territories. Bringing them home was a massive undertaking. Ships arrived every week filled with people who had lost everything. These returnees faced overwhelming challenges. There were few jobs. Many had no homes to go back to. Civilians who had lived in Japanese colonies returned to a homeland they had not seen in decades. Veterans carried trauma. Many Japanese soldiers returned from Siberian labor camps after years of hardship. Japanese civilians had to make space for these returnees in a country that was already struggling. This created new tensions. But over time, families reunited, communities rebuilt, and returnees slowly reintegrated. Throughout this period, one group was quietly influencing daily life in a way that many civilians did not immediately notice. This was the role of the new American-backed government in rewriting the rules of Japanese society. A new constitution and new rights. In 1947, Japan adopted a new constitution. It guaranteed civil liberties, freedom of speech, the right to vote for both men and women, and limitations on government power. The clause renouncing war became one of the most talked about parts of the new constitution. For civilians, the effects were gradual. Schools changed their curricula. Civic education shifted from obedience to critical thinking. Textbooks were rewritten. Teachers were retrained. The emphasis moved from imperial loyalty to democratic participation. Children born during the occupation grew up with a completely different worldview than their parents. This generational contrast shaped Japanese society for decades. But even with these sweeping reforms, daily life still revolved around practical needs: food, shelter, safety, and community. And one event put incredible pressure on civilians and the occupation authorities alike: the 1946-47 food crisis. In the first years of the occupation, food shortages became even more severe. Poor harvests, damaged farmland, and transportation problems created a near famine. The government struggled to distribute what little food existed. Civilians lined up for hours for small rations of rice or wheat. Many families relied on black market food, even though it was illegal. Hospitals saw a rise in malnutrition. Teachers reported that school children fainted in class. Parents skipped meals so their children could eat. The crisis pushed the American authorities to take more aggressive action. Emergency shipments of food arrived, and the occupation government introduced school lunches and better rationing systems. Slowly, the crisis eased. But the memory of hunger stayed with the population long after the occupation ended. It was during this period that Japanese civilians also encountered a new kind of community activism. Grassroots movements and civil society, with new rights and freedoms, people began organizing political groups, unions, cultural associations, and neighborhood committees. Civilians learned how to hold meetings, vote on decisions, and advocate for change. Labor unions gained strength. Farmers formed cooperatives. Women organized groups focused on education, healthcare, and workplace equality. For many civilians, this was the first time they felt they had a voice in national affairs. These movements did not always align with American expectations. Some were left-leaning or supported socialist ideas. In response, American occupation policy shifted again due to Cold War pressure, promoting more conservative forces. Civilians found themselves at the center of a growing political tug-of-war. Even so, participation in civil society opened new paths for civilians to shape the country's future. Civilians and the changing social landscape of the occupation years also brought rapid changes to ordinary social habits. Clothing changed as new fabrics and styles arrived. Diet shifted as bread, canned goods, and American ingredients became familiar. Sports like baseball became even more popular. Children grew up with American cartoons, music, and snacks. Adults attended English language classes offered by occupation staff or local schools. Public health improved as new hygiene standards and medical practices were introduced. These changes did not replace Japanese traditions. Instead, they blended into a hybrid culture that still defines Japan today. Civilians lived through these changes in real time, adapting quickly because they had to rebuild their lives from almost nothing. By the early 1950s, Japan was no longer a country in ruins. Streets were rebuilt, homes returned, jobs stabilized, children filled schools. The once horrifying idea of American soldiers walking through Japanese cities felt almost normal. The end of the occupation came in 1952, and civilians felt the change immediately. The end of occupation, when the occupation formally ended with the signing of the San Francisco Peace Treaty, Japan regained sovereignty. American troops stayed in bases, but Japanese civilians now lived under a government they elected themselves. For many civilians, the end of the occupation meant a sense of pride and relief. They had survived war, hunger, fear, and uncertainty. They had rebuilt neighborhoods, families, and communities. They had adapted to new laws, new culture, and new opportunities. The occupation was not simple. It brought progress and hardship, liberation and control, openness and tension. Civilians experienced all of it at the same time. But when you step back, you can see the larger picture. The Japanese civilians who lived through the occupation carried the weight of war on their shoulders, then rebuilt a foundation for peace. They absorbed new ideas while keeping their identity. They dealt with poverty, fear, and loss, yet found ways to build something better. The modern nation of Japan, with its innovation, stability, and strong democratic institutions, was shaped in large part by the daily struggles and decisions of these ordinary people. Their resilience, their ability to adapt, and their quiet determination to move forward created a society that would eventually become one of the most successful in the world. The American occupation changed Japanese civilian life in ways that were immediate and lasting. It forced civilians to confront defeat and adapt to a new world. It opened doors that had been closed for generations. It challenged traditions, rebuilt communities, and reshaped the country's identity. For Japanese civilians, the occupation was not just a political event. It was a lived experience filled with hunger, fear, hope, and transformation. It was the bridge between wartime destruction and post-war renewal. And it all happened in just 7 years.